Well, once again, a very big hello, and my name's Glynn Harrison. I'm a psychiatrist by trade, but I'm retired now, and I have 3 daughters, which is why I'm interested in men's ministry. Because I've been looking at the world of Christian men through their eyes for many years now, and it is not a pretty sight, is it? Always. And so I've loved running a men's ministry in our church. I started it and ran it. We've now had to leave that particular church, and so that's one of the things I'm missing, but I still love the opportunity to share some of my experience and some of my passion for this area. So thanks very much for coming along. My partner today is Alin. Did I pronounce that correctly? No, I didn't. So Alin, I've stayed at his home. I know his family. I still can't pronounce his name. That's Alin. Just pronounce it properly for me. Padureanu. You see that? And my friend Alin is going to share this session with me. Alin runs all men's ministry organization in Romania that supports men's ministries, as well as generating his own events, his own ministry among men, and he has some great examples to show us of ways in which we can put some of what I'm going to talk about into practice. Okay, so here's what we're going to do for the next hour. We're going to share together the first item in that I'm going to try and convince you that we do have a problem. I hope that it won't take too long, but that's what that we do have. If we look at the world of Christian men, you don't need to look for too long before you say there are some problems here, some issues, some challenges for us. The next part, I'm going to think about some very broad, general approaches in terms of how we might solve this or what solutions there might be. And then we're going to hand over to Alin, who's going to look at some more specific ideas about what one can do with men. So that's a threefold, fairly simple structure. So have we got a problem, first of all? Well, you don't need to pull down too many photographs from church websites to quickly realize that even just the way churches represent themselves, there seems to be a problem of numbers. We have a numbers gap in our churches between men and women. And I wasn't particularly selective. I just went onto a few church websites. Look at this little chap here in this youth group, and he does have a comrade here, but all too often it's these kinds of pictures that one encounters about relatively few boys, men in our churches. This is a great picture, let's face it, but the image that we're projecting to the world is that Christianity is men's business. They're women's business. This church here, oddly enough, I happen to know, does have a lot of men in it, and yet strangely on their website, even they are confirming the stereotype by arranging 4, 8, 9 women and 1 happy-looking chap in the middle here. It's often said, I belong to the Anglican Church myself. I belong to the Anglican. It's often said, who is the typical Anglican in the world? 200 million Anglicans, 50 million Anglicans. And the answer is, she is black, female, poor, and living in a developing country. But it's the she bit that's so characteristic of the Anglican communion generally. And people say this, and it's not presented as if there's an issue there. What is it about our faith that appears to alienate men or fails to win men, or simply generates the notion that it really is a women's business, the Christian faith? And I've been to China, and there seems to be a very similar pattern in China. Africa similarly, certainly Europe, with some wonderful notable examples. Some wonderful notable exceptions rather, but in general I think you'd probably agree with me, but you'll tell me in a few moments. These are some data from the UK Religious Trends Survey. These are broad brushstroke surveys of church attendance, and you can see here that we have the men in purple and the women here in the orangey brown, and this is between 1980 and 2010. And you can see that women have stayed, but you can see the gap between the two. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, hang on a minute, we don't need to do anything. If we just hold on a few more years, hopefully this graph will continue, and in about year 2020, problem over. So let's just sit tight. And that would be interesting, except this graph is only men who are over 65. And the reason we are seeing this pattern in over 65s is, well, it's hard, nobody really knows, but my guess is that this is simply a demographic explanation, that men in general are living longer in England, and they're catching up, they're closing the gap in age expectancy with women. There's always been a gap that women live longer than men, but that gap is narrowing. So I think this is being reflected in our churches, that there's some catching up going on at the moment, as the cohort of men are living longer, and that's feeding into the figures. But it'll flatten back out again once that cohort effect tails off. Here's the real problem. What happens in the 16 to 20 to 29, and you can see that we have a real issue of declining church numbers in general across all of the Protestant churches in the UK, but the gap between men and women is widening between 1980 2005, so that in this crucial age range of 20 to 29, you have almost a 2-to-1 gap. Now, a 3-to-1 gap almost. This is a tragedy. I don't understand why we don't talk about this much more than we do. Because of course, if we sign up, if we believe that in our marriages, in our relationships, the scriptures teach to be equally yoked, you don't need to be a mathematician to see that this isn't just an issue for men, this is an issue for our women. This is an issue for our families. This is an issue for our children. And so we ought to be looking very hard at this question of why is there such an attrition amongst young men in particular. They're like, missionaries used to talk about a remote peoples. I'm a missionary to remote peoples, people who live far away and in small minority populations. Well, here's a mission field, because young men in their 20 to 29s are like a remote peoples group in the Amazon in some of our churches in England. But it's not just a numbers gap, we've got a commitment gap as well. And the commitment gap is that we can often get numbers along to our church activities, but when it requires a bit more commitment and sign up, those numbers begin to fall. So here we have the numbers who commit to home groups in our church. This is just our own church here. It's a church of about 1,000 people. And you can see that there are 2 women to 1 man in the home groups. But again, if you look at the attendance in the home groups, many men discover an interest in babysitting on the night of the home group and say to their wives sacrificially, you go to the home group and I'll stay at home and look after the kids. And many of our home groups, again, you'll tell me in a few minutes when we break, many of our home groups that the men not only don't sign up, but even those that sign up very often don't turn up. And so we have this kind of commitment gap. And this was a leaders training course our church held. And this was just the sign up to be trained in leadership in the church. And you can see that once again, far more women than men signed up for that kind of commitment. And I know that there are all kinds of issues behind this. These men often, because many women stay at home or work part-time, I'm not passing any judgment on that. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying it's a fact on the ground that many women are still at home with the children, part-time work, and men are full-time work. So that does make it easier, perhaps, for women to commit to some of these things. And certainly what's interesting is that we're seeing a fall-off in young women in England in numbers now. That gap is now narrowing because young women in the age 20 to 29 are also beginning to fall off in our churches. And it may be that as they're being drawn into the labour market with the same levels of commitment and intensity, and marriage is being deferred as in men, it's harder to get now women as well as men to commit some of these extra church activities. So we've got a numbers gap, a commitment gap, and one of the really interesting phenomena we need to think about is, I'd suggest to you, we've got a culture gap in the relationship with men and the church. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'd suggest this, that in our culture, church going is gender stereotyped. Now what I mean by that is that church going is seen as an indicator of being a woman and not a man. And I'll come back to that. The second proposition I want to put to you around this culture gap is that the church itself often reinforces the cultural stereotype by the way it presents itself to the world and by the way it conducts itself in the church. Okay? So hang on a minute, you say, unpack that a bit more for me. Let's unpack this. Church going is gender stereotyped in cultural context. What do we mean by that really? Well, remember that gender stereotypes are those cultural modes of behavior and expectation which we attach, for better or worse, to being a male or being a female. All cultures differentiate male from female by various kinds of cultural signals that help differentiate. And of course, one of the classic stereotypes is that boys, you dress in blue in England and girls in pink. Now, it's not the same in all cultures because these are culture specific, but boys play with cars, girls play with dolls, and these are called culture stereotypes. And of course, there's an argument that the reason girls do play with dolls and boys play with cars is because we expect them to, and therefore facilitate their development in line with our expectations. Now, we're not going to get into that argument, but what I want to suggest to you is that just as pink is stereotypical of being a woman, so in our culture, going to church is stereotypical of being a woman. It's part of the stereotype. It's something women do. Now, I was talking to somebody who works, teaches in an Islamic country, and if there's an opportunity, she shares, if somebody asks her, she will share her faith, or at least try to share her faith. But of course, most of her encounters are with women in that culture. And this is terribly interesting, because when she talks about faith in any way, she said very often the women say to me, "Oh, you mean this is religion? Okay, now you need to speak to the men, because in our culture that's men's business." This doesn't belong to us, you see. So that's the opposite kind of culture stereotyping. And I think what we're seeing is the reverse of that in much Western culture, that being involved in church life goes with pink and being a woman and those other stereotypes. It's not men's business. It's not a feature of being a man. It doesn't make you more of a man to go to church. It makes you sort of less of a man. Now, we men, we're very vulnerable little flowers who are easily made to feel anxious. And if a woman does things that are seen as being men's activities, very often, strangely, that makes her more of a woman. So, you know, here, hey girls, guess what I did last night? I went to the store and bought my own paint stripper, and I've got my eye on one of those chainsaws for the garden next. Wow, you know, super woman. She is more of a woman because she takes on these tasks. But, you know, if we say, hey guys, guess what I did last night? I went to the craft store and picked up this cool kit for embroidering pillowcases. You know, the friends are sort of stunned silence. He is less of a man. And we shouldn't underestimate the power of culture stereotypes and cultural expectations to shape the way we feel and behave as men. And my proposition to you is that we're locked into a deeply rooted pattern of cultural expectation, that the Christian faith, with its dying Savior, its dying God, it's a kind of women's business. Thank God for it. I like my wife to go to church, but she's the one who goes to church. Okay? Now, I suggest to you that rather than confront, recognize, fight, engage with this cultural stereotype, very often our churches reinforce it. We do it in several ways. We do it in organizational modeling. But by that I just mean the way we brand ourselves and present ourselves to the world and organize ourselves models a culture which seems to be oriented to the needs and the life of women. I mean, just take branding. This was, in my own Church of England, it's organized into dioceses. You know, the country is split up into 44 dioceses. And in each diocese, they vary in size. The one I'm in is a small one. It's about a population of 1.5 million people. And each diocese has a bishop, and it has a web page in which it presents its activities to the world. Now, my diocese has a great bishop and a very good new web page. But until about 5 years ago, this was its web page. When they scratched their heads and they thought, let's tell the world about the church, you see, they said, we'll put some images up now, what should we do? And this is what they came up with. And this is the actual website. So let me think now. They say, we'll have a single mother with a baby. That's a good idea. We'll have this kind of dreamy girl praying and contemplating. We'll have a sort of a really attractive girl laughing down in the corner by herself. We'll have some sheep. Yep. We'll have a cow flying, and now what kind of a church we have? Oh yeah, some old ruins. Let's have some old ruins, and we'll put this up. And this is the bishop, but leaving him out because he looks quite sort of blokey. But the only man on here, what's happening to him? He's getting married. And for many men, that is the only time they'll go into church, to get married, or maybe a funeral. And so we confirm everything that men think about the church in one simple picture. And just to press home the message, let's put some fluffy around the pictures, like that, fluffy around the pictures. And we're a caring, sharing church, so we'll reach out and have caring, sharing, touching. Men like touching and touchy stuff. So let's do.
a disease of Bristol,
Diocese of Bristol. You couldn't make. We have a saying in England: you couldn't make this up. But somebody did. And often cultures are reinforced and maintained by 1,000 little signals. It's often not big messages in your face. It's all the small things that sustain a way of living. And the church itself so easily plays into this cultural stereotype. And it isn't just it isn't just organizational modeling, it's generational role modeling. What do I mean by this? I mean within churches, the way fathers themselves, what they transmit to their own children about church going. And we've got this great picture here by Norman Rockwell, the American. He was a keen observer of American life in the 50s and 60s. And here you've got a sort of a classical 50s, 60s image. He's just showing what's there. And you see you've got mum who is going to church. Now if I said to you, quick look guys, who is anchoring the spiritual life of this family from the body language? Who is it? It's the mother. And he is simply echoing a cultural reality. It's the mother who anchors the responsibility for the spiritual nurturing of these children. And it's the mother who is insisting that this family goes to church and works out that faith that they have as a family. Dad, he's looking sort of guilty. A part of him knows he should be there. A part of him may even want to be there. I suspect that he's quite pleased that she's going because he knows in his heart that the kids need moral education and they need to be taught the right thing. So he's rather pleased that his wife is carrying this responsibility, but she is not pleased at all to be carrying this and insists nevertheless that it will be done for the sake of the kids, because it is the right thing to do. But this is what I want you to see. Draw a line around this little chap here and this man here. Now, the girls here, they're twins. Just look at their body language. They have their Bible under their left arm the same way as their mum. They have a hat like their mum. They put their left foot out just like their mum. Everything about them shows that they are growing into women just like their mum. And indeed, that's actually very accurate because their trajectory in life is the way of womanhood, and their mother is the model, the one who shows them and leads them that way into the world of women. But look at this little chap here. He's 8, maybe. Just notice, he's got a hat as well, but not a hat like that. He's got a Bible under his arm, but it's not held quite as tightly as these Bibles. And he's smart like his sister, but I don't know, he just didn't put his jacket on quite smartly. But here's the thing, even though his left foot goes out, he leans in toward his father, because he knows that his walk into adulthood is via manhood, and he will not follow his mother, he will follow his father. And gender identification begins between age 2 and 3, and it strengthens round about age 8 through 13. And so it's no use once our boys get to 13 saying, hey, we need a youth group here with maybe 1 or 2 male role models in it. Our boys started planning their exit. They figured out what the journey into manhood is around here 5 years ago, when they looked at their fathers and the men. And even the fathers who came to church, they noticed how they just didn't seem as comfortable as mother. They noticed how during the actions, everyone was doing the actions, their fathers just didn't quite fit in. They noticed when they went for coffee afterwards, Father went down, but he seemed to be keen to get into the car to go home. They noticed that when they had the children dedicated or baptized at church, the father carries them here, but he carries them as if he's protecting himself from this religion. Have you noticed, watch men in church, they take an acute interest in their children in church. You see them take them off their wives and play with them and bounce and have them, because it's a kind of a defense against this world. And of course, I wonder what happens when they get home. I suspect it's back to wife, and out comes the Sunday newspaper. Watch men in church. It's very. Now I know I'm making broad generalizations here, but you don't have to look too hard, certainly in England, to see these kinds of patterns emerging. Now, what I suggest, friends, is this is a tragedy in our churches. We are losing the hearts of our boys and our young men. And I remember saying to a very young father whose boy was coming up to aged, 18 months, 2 years old, and I said, his gender identification, the first phase is starting very soon, over the next 12 months. It's when he looks around and he's saying to himself, and it's not articulated in words so much as at gut level, he's saying, what kind of a one am I? And he looks at his mother and says, am I one of those? Or am I one of those? And this next 12 months is about him concluding, as he looks at his dad, that he's one of those. And I said to Dad, the challenge for you is, when he looks at you, the question is one of those worth having? Is one of those worth being? Is that what one of those does? Because those questions start at age 2 to 3, that one of those behaves like this. And this one has been tutoring his son into a whole set of cultural expectations. And I suppose the corollary of this, the implication is, if we wanted to win, if we wanted to turn around our churches, we could almost forget evangelism outside if we just focused on our boys and young men. What a momentous difference this would make to our churches if we could win our own young men, if fathers could win their own boys. What a calling, what a difference, guys, that might make. So we've got a numbers gap, a commitment gap, some culture gaps that are really quite interesting. And Carl Jung, he noticed some cultural shifts that were underway way back in 1920s, actually. He said this: a man's fight is no longer in the home. He is focused almost entirely on his business, so that as a husband he's glad to have no responsibilities. He gives the complete direction of his family life over to his wife. This is what you call giving independence to the American woman. It is what I call the laziness of the American man. That is why he is so kind and polite in his home, and why he can fight so hard in his business. His real life is where the fight is. The lazy part of his life is where the family is. And we may extend that, just add church on the end. His fight, his sense of identity, who he is and how he lives out his identity, does not include Christian commitment and church commitment. What really captures the heart of many men is their work. Now, I know that we're going to break questions in a moment, and many of you would want to say, I think what you're describing, Glynn, I recognize it, but I think this is breaking down very quickly now as sex roles change in society. And I agree with that, but this is still typical of very many families and homes in our churches, I suggest to you. And we have the rise of the pal dad, Jung would say, in which the father's play with the child is no longer a means to the end of character building, but the man's reward for his sacrifice and duty outside of the home. And a number of social commentators have said that over the past few decades, men have disengaged from their responsibilities in the home, and certainly in the 20s to the 50s, 60s, handed over many of those responsibilities for character development of their kids to their wives and to experts like Dr. Spock and so on. And men withdrew, and their fight was at work. And with that, in Christian churches, there went the responsibility for the spiritual development and formation of children generally. All of this fed into the notion that this is women's business. So we have generational role modeling as well as organizational role modeling. It's a great question. The question is, how did this happen? How did we have this division of labor in which responsibility for character, spiritual formation moved towards the mother and women in the home, and the father was taken out of the home? Now, it's the kind of thing that sociologists write about and speculate about. One of the best is somebody called Callum Brown, an English book. He's written a book called The Death of Christian Britain. And his theory is that it really started with the Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution that took men away from the home, farming communities, local, urbanization, which disrupted families, took men into factories. They came home exhausted. The women obviously stayed at home for much of that time, although many of them worked in factories as well, but not full time. And that was how this partition of duties occurred. He also went on to say the two great wars strengthened that because they took men out of the home for years on end. And at the end of the Second World War, for example, many men came back to children aged 4 who they'd never met. And meantime, Callum Brown says, women had grouped together. In the late 40s, 50s, new experts emerged like Dr. Spock, and child experts. Women began reading this, and they began listening to these men, the experts. And so the father's role in the home just diminished. Now, these are broad generalizations. You will know many dads who aren't like this, who are very involved with their kids. And we're seeing a reversal of many of these patterns today as feminism is releasing women into the same kind of responsibilities as men, and therefore there's an insistence that there's a sharing of these duties. And so, for example, in some churches, you will see men who are very involved with their kids and love it. And so I'm aware that I've got to be careful about stereotyping manhood with some of these assertions. But nevertheless, I think in general, they're still broadly true, and at least part of the explanation. Yes. So it's a very interesting point our brother's making here, which is that is there something even more fundamental going on in society more generally, in which some of the classic or typical stereotypical male behaviors are being squeezed out of our social cultural life more generally. And you could argue that what is being valued in business much more, it's teamwork, it's empathy, it's relationships. Certainly in medicine, my own area, I'm a doctor, the criteria for becoming a doctor have changed over the years, and they've been weighted much more towards relationship skills. And so girls at 18 are far more verbal, relational, sensitive, and the boys come in and they're less relationally fluid, they're less mature, and so some medical schools are up to 65% women, 35, and so that is an interesting question. Is it that some of those typical characteristics that we see being associated with masculinity are being finding it harder to find a place in society, let alone the church? It's a very interesting point. Yeah. Gabriella here says, so what are we doing to hinder? In my experience of having run men's ministry, but I don't want to overgeneralize this, but in my experience, the women are just tremendously supportive of men's ministry because they want to see something that motivates their husbands and anchors his faith and ignites his faith. So I've just found nothing amongst girlfriends, wives, than support for this. And when you say what can we do to, what are we doing that's hindering it? There is this term, the feminization of the church. Have you heard this? The feminization of the church, as if we're saying it's the women, it's it's them. You see, they're doing this to us. The church these women are feminizing everything and driving us poor little men out, and I just find that a bit pathetic. You'll not hear me talk about the feminization of the church. I think the correct term is the demasculinization of the church. I find myself saying, thank God that the women step up and do the kind of things very often that men could do as well as them. The two could be doing together. I say, thank God that our mission field, 2-to-1 women with the guts and the resilience to go out on the mission field. When I look at missionaries, some of the stuff that women do, and we men talk about the feminization of the church, I just think it's a bit pathetic on our part. So let's talk about, this is our problem, not women's problem. This is a men's problem, and I think the solution needs to come from men, and the imagination needs to start in men's hearts that we're going to do something about it, and that's my passion anyway. I think women do enough fabulous work, and so look, let's think, what kind of things can we do? And I'm going to hand over to Alin in just a moment, but I want to give a couple of broad principles. All right, the first is culture eats strategy for breakfast. Have you heard this term? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. We have a term in English, you think you're big, well, this will eat you for breakfast. And it means that you're little and you'll be eaten up. And this term, culture eats strategy for breakfast, simply means that very often we think we come up with a plan. And, it changes things for a few minutes, a few days, a few months. But sooner or later, culture reasserts its grip on the way we do things, because culture's woven into our hearts, deeply into us. And so, for example, at our church, I said, let's role model for our boys better than this, because every time we have some choruses at the front, he says, let's have 3 or 4 of the teenagers out, 4 girls go out and model to the children, do the choruses. You understand? And I said, let's intentionally always have 2 boys, 2 girls. And let's choose some boys who are rugby players, And so we did, and it was really great. I was so proud that we'd say, let's have some choruses. And our boys, they'd been told, and they'd been primed, but two guys got up there as well. And it was going so well, and then I noticed a few months later, we were back to 4 girls. And that's a simple example of culture eats strategy for breakfast. We try, but you push the thing in and then it bounces back again. So we need to be mindful of, if we're going to do something about this, it's going to take sustained work and application and perseverance. And there are a couple of things. So we've got to change the culture, and that's hard work, changing the culture. Misogyny is not required. We don't need to put women down to get ourselves up. I took in our men's ministry, I took a hard view about misogyny. We don't need to talk about girls like that. Paul never spoke about women in ways that diminished women. It was always in ways that elevated them. And it's another sign of our weakness as men that we speak of women sometimes in the way we do when we're together. Misogyny isn't required to develop a men's ministry. We can value the feminine in men as well. We have to be careful about not stereotyping our men's work, our solution to this. So we say we're going to have a motorbike Sunday, or we'll put on big beefy leather things when we go to church, and chains things. Can you imagine me I like ballet. Alin there, you see. I think we make a good pair, Alin and I, because Alin's a different kind of bloke to me. But my point is that men's ministry should not stereotype and say it's guys who have some of the more classic stereotypical features only that we're after. You know, you've got to go for the whole range of guys. And so challenge these stereotypes rather than play into them. But it's still men that we're going for. And there are two things. You need leadership and vision, which I've just spoken about, and that's going to mean you guys, you and a friend who feel God's hand on you to say we're going to do something in our church. Do not underestimate that this is going to be challenging and hard work. But what I suggest is that you make sure that first of all you try and interest the whole church rather than simply do something on the side, like start a small men's ministry. Try and get the whole church to see that this is a problem. Otherwise, you'll always be up against it. And that isn't easy, but I'm saying don't just start a men's ministry, change culture across the church. Because if you start a men's ministry, it's a bit like a creche. You know, a creche, that's where you put, a creche is where you take the babies to in church when they cry. You know, you take them to the creche. So in a men's ministry can be like that. It can be, oh, we need something for the men, so we put it over there. We haven't solved the problem of what's going on in our church by starting something. So the first part of developing or addressing this issue needs to say, what do we need to do for the whole church? How can I galvanize our church? How can I it's tough because it's culture that you're taking on. But I would at least try and win the leadership. Go and see the elders. Go and talk to them about it. And this is a great way of doing it. Carry out a church audit. Say, do you mind if I just hand out a survey which just counts the number of men and women in all the different activities, and then show them in simple graphs? And it's often just shocks people into saying, this is what's going on. Just show people. Don't confront, don't get angry, you know, just show them what's going on and say, surely God has a heart for these men who we're losing. What can we do together for this? I'm certainly happy if you were interested to lead some initiatives in this area. Once you begin to involve your leadership and at least get their support, then think about starting a men's ministry. Okay? And Alan's going to talk a bit more about this in a moment. I just want to say that this is one of the key parts of a men's ministry, develop leaders. And when I ran the men's ministry, I never stood up in front of the men. I never introduced meetings. I never gave announcements. I never did anything in it that anybody really saw. Now, you know, the guy who runs this, Greg, you know Greg, who runs everything, whose idea this conference was, who is behind all the seminars and all of the planning of this hotel and everything that happens, and whether these, you know, Greg, who's seen him? Who's seen Greg? Yeah, you know, 2 people, and yet you're here because of him. And I call that a very interesting kind of leadership. It's leading from the back, and it's leading in a way which motivates and draws out the leadership of others and gives them space to develop their confidence in gifts and leadership, you see. Greg Pritchard. And so he's a great example of this. And when I get asked to speak at men's breakfasts, as I do, we have things called men's breakfasts in very many churches in England. Saturday morning, you invite a speaker, they eat bacon and eggs, and then you have a speaker. And I speak at many of these. It's often older men like me who turn up, very few young men. And so what kind of leaders do you want? You know, cultivate young leaders right from the beginning. And this was the team of leaders that I cultivated. You see, these are them. He's a student. He's a post-grad, he's a young artist, woodworker, and this man works in IT. This was the team we got, and these were the guys who appeared at the front. And guys love being coached, you know. They give an announcement, you say, how do you feel that went? You know, and they say, well, it was a bit of a, we have a phrase, pig's ear in England, meaning it was a mess. So they really like it if you honor them, but you say, I agree, it was a pig's ear. So you need to do that. Forget him doing it next week. You need to go back and do it again. And this time, get here on time, rehearse it in your mind, and win these men with that announcement, that advert for this event. And then he comes back and he does it, and you say, brilliant. Now, I was so proud when you did that. You've got to watch being patronizing, but in general, young men love being motivated and admired by older men who they respect. So cultivate young men into leadership. They're just two of my tips. Win the whole church and develop your leaders, and lead if you can from the back. Alin, there's one of our other leaders. And who knows, if God blesses what we're doing, we may turn some of our men in men not like this, but men like that. I took this picture at the Wailing Wall, and this man, and I'm not suggesting we all wear hats like this or become Jewish Orthodox, but I am suggesting that we take on the responsibilities of fatherhood as this man has, because he's taken his boys to pray. And look at their body language. They stoop a little like their father. They stoop their heads. They follow. There are no question marks about how they see their future trajectory, what men do, what men look like, what their spiritual commitment is. They haven't got to figure it out, these boys. Their father takes them to pray, and he prays with them. And so maybe God will put it into our hearts. Even just one person here, put it into our heart. I'm going to, God's calling me to do something in my church for the hearts of men. Then I'll have felt, this was a good session today.
We have faced these things in Romania also. So we have faced the problem. We have prayed and seek the Lord for the solution, and what we're here for, what I'm here for, is to share with you and encourage you to step up to the plate. It is working, it's proven, and the Lord is faithful. If there's somebody willing to step and do something about any problem that comes our way, we have the full support from God to deal with it and work. I want to start with a quote of Ben Kinchlow that says, "To be a male is a matter of birth. To be a man, it's a matter of choice." So our challenge for you, my challenge for you tonight, is to make sure that you don't give up in making the choice to be a real man. Even though some of us, a lot of us, are suffering and don't have real male models to look up to. Maybe our fathers were not there present, and they have not participated in our growing, and they were not the ones to develop our character and discipline us. And it was a mother that took place, like in my situation. But there is hope, and there are men willing to disciple, willing to invest their life in the young generation. So make that choice and stay with what the Lord has for you. And we all agree, after all that has been said here tonight, this evening, that there's a change that is necessary. Do you agree with that? Everybody agrees that there's a change that needs to take place? Well, a change only comes with a decision, and you may seem surprised, but we all have to decide to change. We all have to decide and get involved in what the Lord has for everybody, for every one of us, and step into our calling. And if we saw this need, I would say that when change is necessary, Dr. A.R. Bernard from New York Cultural Center said this: when change is necessary, not to change becomes destructive. If you need to change your diet, and the doctor is prescribing this for you, and you're not paying attention to it, and you're not making the change, you'll have to suffer consequences. It applies in relationship. If you have relationships that suffer and require a major change in there, if you're not changing, you will contribute to the destruction of that relationship. It applies in a working environment, in a community, in a church, and especially to men's ministry. I'm sure you are here because you are interested in the topic. You're interested in the subject. And if you are, and you see the changes that are necessary to take place, our prayer is that you will step into this calling and make the change that is necessary. You should be more dedicated to this. Maybe it's something that just was stirring in your heart, in your mind. But if you hear these challenges, all the arguments that Glynn has brought us and showed, they should motivate us and be a confirmation that there's something that needs to be done in order to change the environment in our churches, the men in our churches. And what a better motto to work under than what Paul was writing to the Colossians. Christ in you, the hope of glory. It's Him that we preach, and teaching every man in all wisdom, so that we admonishing every man, that we may present every man perfect in Christ Jesus. There's no better model to portray before the men in our churches than Christ the Lord. It's not very popular model these days when ego is so boosted up and so promoted, because Christ was one that was willing to sacrifice, was willing to pay the price, was willing to take the blame for everything that we have been guilty of. So I challenge you to step into this calling and do something about the men in your church. If you are not the senior pastors, as Glynn has suggested, talk to the senior pastor, talk to the leadership of the church, and start something for the men in your church. And here are a few things that we have done, that I've done in Romania in the men's ministry. And one of the things is we have put the emphasis on relationships. And the way we started it was to get a lot of pastors in pastors' conferences and local gatherings to share the vision that we have for the men in the local community or the local church. And the idea was to promote the men's small groups. I believe that there's where the real change takes place. When everybody can share the burden, the temptation that he's facing, and even sins that they want to get rid of and repent of, they can get the right assistance, and the small men's group can be a perfect environment to get the help and support that we all need from, because the Lord has created us to live and flourish in a community. And not last, I put it the number one. And I'm hoping that you are the person that's willing to do that. To pay the price and minister and structure something for the men in your church. And in order to do this, there's accountability that's required, mentoring and recreational activities. A lot of men are having their schedule full. They don't need another activity to be added to their list. So make sure you're doing this activity. The men's ministry will all taking these things in consideration. And if you want to do this, you've got to be authentic and passionate. You got to put a lot of time into it. You got to make yourself vulnerable and not play the saint in front of them. Don't play the untouchable person that's perfect and blameless. Be vulnerable and let them see you, the real you. Let them see the challenges that you are facing, that you're a normal person, but that's willing to make a choice and be a man according to the model that we have portrayed in Jesus. And not lastly, stay Christ-focused, stay Christ-centered. There's a lot of things, a lot of people, a lot of great men who are very talented, very capable, but look at Christ. I mean, He's the blameless model and the model that we all should look at. A men's ministry should involve teaching and discussions specific to men's heart. We've discovered that just preaching to men, it's not working. Men in general, and we know our story, a lot of times we're tired of another sermon to hear. But we all like to make our points across and say, hey, this is what I think. Look, I have this idea in my mind. This is what I believe it's going to work. This is what we should do, or this is the things that I'm struggling. Don't just preach to men. Create an environment when everybody can share. They will not be laughed at. They will not be disconsidered with what they were saying, but there will be an environment where they can be open and feel safe with you. John Townsend said that there's few ways that, in his book, How Adults Learn, there's few ways that we as adults are learning. First, we got to choose, or we either want to learn or we have to learn. There's situations that are forcing us to study or be interested in a certain topic or a situation, and we are looking into. By linking learning to experience, there's so many ways that you can teach the gospel, and I will show you later on how we're using different kind of activities to teach the men the biblical principles. And then we're learning as adults by practicing, being with somebody that's already in the ministry doing, already in the job that you're pursuing. That's another way that we learn. And then we need help and guidance. Nobody has been born knowing everything. We are learning, and it's good that it'd be good if we will continue to learn for as long as we will live. That's a wise person that will continue to learn for all the days of his life. We are learning, and there are things that we need to discover. And make sure you're doing all these things in a non-threatening environment. And basically, it's desirable and 100% that I'm emphasizing here, with all due respect for Gabriela now, it should be a men-only environment. If you want to talk about pornography, about sexuality, about sins, men will not feel comfortable to talk about their sin, about their struggles in front of a woman or a child. There's got to be a men-only environment. Okay. And if they don't want, you can call this guy, and he'll help them. You know, he'll pray for them or push them into the work. It's just something that was supposed to be funny. We only have 5 minutes left, so develop servants. Work and do the ministry with this thing in mind. Develop servants. Model for them. Coach them. Encourage them to do the work. Don't do it yourself. And I'm so thrilled to hear Glynn's experience and way of working in his own church, because it's such a great confirmation. I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to be like him because I'm looking at him with respect. But sometimes, you know, I forgot, and I like to be in front of the men in Romania and challenge them to do the work. But we've got to do even this until somebody is prepared and ready to take over from there. And have Jesus as a model, and encourage the men to embrace the calling that the Lord has for them. So many times I've seen in my experience very gifted, talented men, very capable, that I wished that they would come and work with me under my under our organization and bring his talents in our work. But it was not what the Lord has called him to do. And I would have been too selfish, and I would have been setting myself for destruction if I would have brought him in. That's why keep in mind, we are not called to make clones of ourselves, but we are called to encourage men and assist them to grow into Christ-likeness. Be what the Lord wants them to be. Okay? One of the experiences I have, because I've done these things in Romania, we have 87 volunteers. Out of the small groups that we have developed in the local churches, we've been able to create an army of volunteers to represent the Lord in the Romanian prison systems with this program that's been approved by the Minister of Justice, and it's been credited with 25 credits, which is the maximum that a prison system offers for an educational program. It's called A Day with Daddy. And you can be a better father too. This is what we're encouraging the prisoners with. And it works with 14 weekly meetings in the prison system, inside the prison, with a group of between 10 and 15 prisoners, where we are studying the life of Joseph out of a curriculum that we have. And in these 4 months, almost 4 months, the prisoners are allowed to come outside of the prisons for 1 day to spend some time with the family in a setting like this, where we're doing all kinds of activities and games. The atmosphere is very emotional, because when they're visited by the family in the prison, they're not allowed to hug themselves, and if they're at the maximum security, they can only talk with their family through glass, like you see in movies. And there's children that are suffering, very traumatized by this, because I spoke with a lady and she was very grateful to us because we've done this program and we fought to have it on. She said, "Thank you so much, because our daughter, she touched the glass at home, hoping that her dad will appear for a visit and to talk to him." So this is the kind of activities that we have. In one of the outings, it's got a social impact. We call it We Care Too. We went to an orphanage and cut 2 trucks of 2 truckloads of wood and stored it for winter with the prisoners. And then afterwards, they've been able to sit with the kids and their own family and sit at the table and had some games. And on another outing, we've created our own aqua park. 15 plastic foil and a ton of water, and it was so much fun. This family is back together because of the program, because the wife was seeing somebody else already, because he's got a few years to be in prison. He said, "I'm not going to wait 4 years until he comes out. I'm going to go on with my life." But because he was pretty abusive with her. But when she heard that he's in this program, she said, "I'm going to give us another chance." And she came with the son. This man is for the very, very first time when he holds his baby. He was arrested when his wife was still pregnant, and he got in prison. He saw his son for the very first time. This other guy, his name is Christy. He's outside the prison for the very first time after 14 years. It's the first time he holds his daughter like that. It's the first picture he has with his daughter. And all of these had happened because there were men willing to embrace the call that the Lord Jesus has for them. They were discipled by men like you, encouraged, assisted to step into their calling. And because of that, the Lord has blessed it. So I'm going to end up with a high honor that we've experienced at the National Gala of Social Assistance in Romania. It's the highest prize you could ever receive. And we've been honored to have that. The Minister of Justice in Romania has honored us with words of appreciation and encouragement. And these are the blue dots that you see here are the 16 prisons that the program is active. 87 men who decided to embrace the call because they have been discipled themselves by people like me and Glynn, and you can do the same thing. I want to thank you very much for your attention and for being here, being interested in the men in your congregation. And I pray with all my heart that the Lord is gonna stir something in your spirit to do something for the men in your churches, in your close, immediate